Well, my name is Glenn Ivey. I'm the state's attorney for Prince George's County. I am a Kappa man as well. So I appreciate all the accolades to the successful brother here, but we're trying to do our thing too. So please keep us in mind. I know I didn't wear the red tie by accident. We definitely want to bring it out. I want to thank you all for inviting me out today and giving me a chance to speak on this because it's been interesting for me to have a chance to really kind of think about Dr. King in sort of a comprehensive way. I am indeed from Rocky Mount, North Carolina, and yeah, it was the big city. I just ran into somebody a little while ago, and he said he was from Rocky Mount. I said, really? I was from Rocky Mount too. And he said, okay, I'm not really from Rocky Mount. We just, talk about the big city. And I'm like, wow, what town are you from if Rocky Mount is the big city? But Rocky Mount is sort of the lodestar for me. I was there in the 60s. In fact, I was living there when Dr. King was killed. And the interesting thing about that was that I could see the changes that the civil rights movement brought as it moved forward, because it had an impact right there in Rocky Mount. So, for example, we lived across the street from Booker T. Washington High School. And you know just from the name that was a pre-integration school, right? When the integration came, they closed Booker T. Washington. And everybody went to Rocky Mount High School, and that's something we'll come back to in a minute. One of the institutional shifts. But I remember all of a sudden we could go to any swimming pool, and sometimes we'd be traveling back and forth, and no, we didn't all have to sleep on the same pull-out couch instead of being able to sleep in a hotel and you get a bed kind of thing, because those things fell as the movement moved forward. And so for me, there was a real direct impact in that sense. And also in the broader sense. My father, Van Ivey, God bless him, he's got Alzheimer's now, and I go see him now, and sometimes he's kind of remembering things, and sometimes he's not. I went to see him over the weekend, and he didn't remember what's going on now, but he remembered Rocky Mount. He was from Rocky Mount, my mother was from Rocky Mount too. And for him, his father had been a brick mason, he became a brick mason. Then he joined the Air Force and used the GI Bill to finish his college education. Didn't come to Bowie State, but he went to Shaw and got his degree there. And then he became part of the War on Poverty, one of the programs that Lyndon Johnson started as a result of the civil rights movement. I know, I love the Clintons, but the talk about LBJ doing it all, that's not the way it really went down. A lot of those, the Voter Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, none of that stuff would have happened without the Civil Rights Movement and Martin Luther King and everybody who was out there walking those streets. He went to work for something called Manpower. And what Manpower was about was trying to help people find jobs who didn't have them. And they couldn't have started it too early in Rocky Mount. That was the tobacco era. And tobacco was pretty much all we had back then. Unfortunately, Eastern North Carolina didn't make the transition. So you got the technology triangle over in the Raleigh area. We stayed tobacco. Tobacco's been phased out. Any of you all from that area, when you go back to visit Rocky Mount or Greenville or whatever, it's really tough going economically there because there's really no economic base left. But he worked for Manpower and tried to help people find jobs through that government program and other war on poverty programs. Then we moved up to the DC area, and he continued that work in the city. Now, the reason I spent so much time on Rocky Mount is I want to talk about Dr. King's last book. It's called Where Do We Go From Here, Community or Chaos? I didn't realize Dr. King had written so much until I got to college and started, just having me in the library and this whole shelf of books by him. He wrote about 5, if I'm not mistaken. And for those of you all who were students and struggling with your course loads, keep in mind that he wrote his PhD dissertation while he was leading the bus boycott in Montgomery. Okay? So he'd do the bus boycott during the day and then come home at night and write on his dissertation. That was a bad brother there. Bad brother. And I believe he wrote 5 books. Where Do We Go From Here is the last one. And I remember reading that one when I was in school back in the early 80s and thinking about how prescient he had been, how he'd seen problems that are still with us then and unfortunately are still with us today, and it talked about how to move forward. Before I go on to that, though, the where do we go from here, let me talk about how we got where we are right now. Let me go back to North Carolina real quick. When I was a kid in Rocky Mount in 1968, we didn't lock the doors, right? You went to school. You did whatever your teachers told you. They could have said, jump off the roof. You jumped off the roof. And if you didn't, they called home. And what did you get when you got home? Yeah. If you got in trouble in the neighborhood, what happened? You know, I'm talking about before the timeout corner, right? And you know, the neighbor could beat you if you did something. And you know, I would run home. Well, I would time it, actually, because if I got home while Mom was home first, but Dad wasn't home yet, she'd beat me. And then when Dad come home, she'd tell him what I did, and then he whooped me too. So I try and time it so they would hear about it both at the same time, so I only get one whooping out of it, right? And you know, education, I remember my parents saying things like, you got to be twice as good. You know, you got to go to class. I didn't even know that high school was an option until I got to high school. And I was like, oh, you don't have to go to college? You know, you don't have to go to high school. There are people you can drop out of high school. I didn't realize that because the focus on education was so big. Drugs, I didn't even know what they were. If you said drugs to me, I would have thought you meant like, you know, aspirin or cough syrup. You know, but heroin, cocaine, marijuana, I mean, just unthinkable stuff. And violence. You know, in the entire time we lived in Rocky Mount, I don't ever recall hearing about one homicide. Not one. And if you think about, too, the sexuality stuff, right? Because, you know, if somebody said something about a hoe back in Rocky Mount, they meant a gardening tool, okay? They weren't talking about a woman. You know, it's just unheard of. To refer to a woman that way was just unthinkable. Now, let's move forward a few years, okay? Let's talk about where we are and how we got here right now. After Dr. King was shot, I remember it was the first time I saw my mother cry. And you know, it was deeply moving to me because Dr. King had been this figure. For those of you that live down south, you might remember this, that people would have on the wall, they had those little kind of fuzzy, they were kind of paintings or something, I don't know what it was. But Dr. King would be in the middle, Bobby Kennedy would be on one side, and John Kennedy would be on the other. And they were all looking up to the heavens, right? Remember those? Remember those? And they had this almost quasi-deity status in the community. So when Dr. King was killed, it's hard to explain to young people what a shattering impact that was for the community. I mean, we'd all been expecting it. You know, we say, you know, there's no way he's going to get away with this one this time. They're going to get him, you know. And we just, year after year, you knew it was coming. But it was still shocking when it actually happened. And then you had the riots, all right? Then Bobby Kennedy was killed. I remember when Dr. King was killed, my mom, you know, she was crying, but she said, well, at least we still got Bobby. All right, and what was it, about 2 months later, he was killed in California at the end of the California primary. I believe it was in June. And so there was this sense of, well, what do we do now? Where do we go from here?